The world watched as the king of late night wept uncontrollably on live television, revealing the staggering cost of his career. An old woman arrived carrying a forgotten letter that proved his greatest success was built upon his most heartbreaking personal failure. The famous red curtain, the sparkling set of Studio One in Burbank, California, always represented one thing: total, absolute control. This was a fortress built around the precision timing of a comedy icon, where every laugh was earned, every gesture rehearsed, and every moment of silence was deliberate. But on this specific night in 1984, during the tail end of his blistering opening monologue, Johnny Carson was about to encounter a moment of raw, unscripted humanity that would shatter that famous control forever. The joke he was telling, a perfectly timed piece about Washington politics, landed with the usual thunderous ovation led by Ed McMahon's signature laugh. Johnny was leaning back against the desk, adjusting his tie, soaking up the energy of the crowd, completely in his element. He was the king of late night, untouchable, unflappable, and that stage was his kingdom. And then a single voice sliced through the residual laughter like a shard of glass. It wasn't a whoop or an applause break or a drunken heckle. It was a woman's voice, strained and sharp, coming from the shadowed third row near the aisle. The laughter didn't just fade, it stopped entirely, cut clean. For 2 beats, there was a vacuum of sound so profound it seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. The cameras, the crew, even the audience, everyone froze, instantly aware that a sacred rule had been violated. This simply did not happen on The Tonight Show. Ed McMahon, who had perfected the art of reacting perfectly to every cue for decades, held his laugh mid-guffaw, his face shifting from jovial mirth to a look of profound confusion. Doc Severinsen slowly lowered his trumpet, his eyes wide, scanning the darkness just beyond the lights. Johnny Carson himself, the man who could handle any disaster, any rogue animal, any unexpected star, stood absolutely still. His smile, the famous, brilliant Carson smile, didn't vanish, but it suddenly felt brittle, like thin ice stretched over deep water. He turned his head slowly toward the third row, his legendary quick wit entirely suspended. He didn't look annoyed or professionally inconvenienced. He looked like a man who had just heard a ghost whisper his name. The voice had called him out, not Johnny Carson the host, but Johnny the man. The shock rippled through the audience. People craned their necks, whispering questions. What did she say? Who is that? The cameras, expertly trained to keep the focus strictly on the stage, wavered for a split second, trying to find the source of the chaos. The house lights, so bright on the stage, deliberately left the audience in a gentle, protective darkness, making it hard to see the interloper. But as the crew frantically tried to isolate the sound, the figure stood up, a small, gray-haired woman leaning heavily on the back of the seat in front of her. She looked utterly ordinary, almost fragile, but the look in her eye was one of decades-old purpose. She was not a deranged fan or a publicity seeker, she was a messenger. And the message she delivered was 7 words long, carrying the weight of a life misspent. The words themselves had been spoken loudly enough for the microphones to catch, loud enough for 20 million homes to hear, but too bizarre and too intimate for anyone present to immediately grasp their true meaning. They were not for the audience, they were only for Johnny. As he slowly dropped the microphone from his lips, taking a step closer to the edge of the stage, Johnny Carson's face lost all color. He saw the woman, and the recognition, sharp and painful, hit him. The king of late night, the master of ceremonies, suddenly looked like a frightened young man whose biggest secret had been exposed to the entire world. The laughter was gone, the control was gone, and now the 7 words hung in the air, a devastating accusation waiting for a devastating answer. The silence that descended upon Studio One was heavier and more unnatural than any quiet the veteran crew had ever experienced. It was the kind of silence that happens when a secret, long hidden, finally claws its way into the light. The 7 words, delivered with the righteous indignation only true heartbreak can fuel, were now echoing in every corner of the vast room. And they were the most devastating words Johnny Carson had ever heard. You never gave her the letter, Johnny. It was not a threat, nor a plea, nor a desperate cry for attention. It was an intimate, historical, and deeply accusatory statement. aimed squarely at the man who had perfected the art of keeping his private life hermetically sealed. The sheer specificity of the shout, the letter, her Johnny, made the studio audience go instantly cold. This wasn't a random heckler, this was someone tied irrevocably to the man behind the smile. Johnny stood frozen for a beat too long, his hand still suspended in the air where he'd been holding the microphone. The genuine confusion that first flickered across his face melted quickly, replaced by something far more complex, a terrible, slow recognition that aged him 20 years in an instant. He dropped the microphone not with a flourish or a comedic gesture, but simply letting it fall to the carpet with a muffled thud that seemed thunderous in the oppressive quiet. This was the moment the professional Johnny Carson vanished, and the man named John turned to face his past. He waved a single, urgent hand toward Doc Severinsen and the band, a signal that was not a cue but a command for absolute stillness. Doc, a professional who had read Johnny's moods for decades, immediately understood the gravity. He slowly replaced his trumpet on its stand, the bright, sparkling brass suddenly looking out of place in this drama. Johnny took that slow, deliberate step away from the desk, moving toward the shadows where the woman stood. He didn't rush or react with anger. His entire demeanor was one of somber submission to a history he thought he had successfully outrun. The cameras, now rolling without direction, focused on the agonizing trajectory of this king walking toward his fate. The woman, whom we will soon know as Ruth, stood absolutely her ground. She was small, dressed in a sensible coat, her hair a wispy white halo under the spotlights now subtly shifting to isolate her. She wasn't shouting again, her message had been delivered. She was simply waiting for the man to answer the question that had been silently echoing across 4 decades. The audience could only exchange nervous, wide-eyed glances. Even Ed McMahon, the voice of boisterous support, simply stared at the floor, instinctively recognizing a boundary no one should cross. When Johnny finally spoke, his voice was low, raspy, and completely unamplified, forcing the entire studio to strain forward to hear his response. The sound engineers, veterans of 1,000 tapings, had to scramble to adjust the levels on the remaining stage microphone, capturing a raw, unpolished tone the American public had never heard from him before. "Ruth," he said, his voice barely a breath, "after all this time, why here?" He knew her. The revelation was crushing. The woman was not just a messenger, she was a witness. Johnny did not look angry or even regretful yet. He simply looked defeated, as if a great weight he had carried in secret had finally been exposed to the full scrutiny of the public eye. His blue eyes, usually dancing with mischief, were momentarily empty, fixed on a memory he couldn't escape. The section closed on the image of the greatest entertainer in the world, standing exposed and vulnerable, waiting for the woman to deliver the second, more painful blow of the evening. He said her name, Ruth, and with that single word, the spotlight didn't just illuminate the stage, it reached back 40 years to a different time, a different life, and a different John Carson. Who was this woman, this quiet messenger who held the power to bring the king of late night to his knees? Ruth was the older sister of Clara Hayes. Back in 1945 in Norfolk, Nebraska, John Carson wasn't the star he became. He was a young, ambitious kid fresh out of the Navy, trying to figure out how to be funny in front of a microphone. And Clara, Ruth's younger sister, was the only woman who ever saw the man behind the jokes. She was soft-spoken, vibrant, and utterly devoted to the impossible dream John carried. They were the kind of couple everyone assumed would last, the talented boy who dreamed too big and the grounded girl who loved him fiercely enough to let him go. But life, as it always does, intervened. Clara became gravely ill with a progressive ailment just as Johnny got his first big break in Omaha, an opportunity that demanded his full, ruthless attention. He was offered the world, but the ticket required him to leave Clara behind. Ruth had been a silent witness to that agonizing choice. She was the one who held Clara's hand on the difficult nights, the one who saw the pain in Clara's eyes when Johnny's letters, the frequent, funny, impersonal letters about his career, arrived. And Ruth knew the terrible truth. On the last day he was supposed to see Clara before leaving Nebraska for good, John wrote a letter. It wasn't the funny, professional kind. It was a letter that contained a desperate declaration of love, a promise to forsake the career and stay with her, if only she would say the word. It was his ultimatum, his heart laid bare on cheap paper. But he never gave it to Clara. He left it in his suit pocket, afraid of what her response might be, afraid of having to choose between the woman he loved and the legendary future he was chasing. He left Nebraska, and he built a kingdom on the unspoken words of that letter. Clara, never knowing the depth of his devotion, believing he had chosen fame over her, passed away just a year later. And it was Ruth who found the original copy of that letter tucked away in a trunk years later, a letter that confirmed her sister's deepest fears. John Carson had loved her, but he didn't tell her when it mattered most. Ruth had kept that secret, that piece of evidence of a man's youthful cowardice and a woman's heartbreaking misunderstanding, for nearly 4 decades. She had watched Johnny's success, his wealth, his endless stream of celebrity interviews, knowing that the foundation of his immense fame rested on one unforgivable act of silence. And that was why she was here now, finally able to afford a trip to Burbank, finally able to get a ticket to a show she never wanted to see. She wasn't seeking revenge, she was seeking completion for her sister. The full, heartbreaking scope of this personal drama, the one that defined Johnny Carson's entire emotional life, was now poised to play out live on the air. A lifetime of regret distilled into a single terrifying question that she had waited 40 years for him to answer. The only sound in Studio One was the subtle hiss of the air conditioning, a mechanical breath beneath the weight of human silence. Johnny Carson stood at the lip of the stage, separated from Ruth by only a few feet and 4 decades of success, and the conversation that followed was the most unscripted, raw exchange ever broadcast from that desk. "I didn't expect to see you here, Ruth," Johnny finally said, his voice quiet and rough, completely unlike the smooth, rehearsed cadence America knew. Or to hear those words. Ruth did not back down. She simply looked at him, her gaze firm but not hateful. "I know you didn't, John, but 40 years is a long time to keep a woman's dignity." Locked away in a drawer, she took a deep, steadying breath. Clara waited. Every day she waited for the letter she knew you had written, the one where you told her she mattered more than the lights. Johnny looked down, his famous, handsome profile etched with a profound, sudden weariness. It was the face of a man caught, not by paparazzi or rivals, but by his own conscience. "I remember writing it," he confessed, the admission a quiet thunderclap across the silent studio. "I wrote it the night before I left Omaha. It was all true. Everything in it was the absolute truth." He paused, looking back up at Ruth, his eyes brimming with a moisture he fought desperately to contain. "But I couldn't deliver it. I stood on that doorstep, the envelope in my hand, and I lost my nerve." Ed McMahon, still seated at his desk, was visibly shaking his head, not in judgment, but in pure, empathetic shock. This was not their Johnny. This was a man confessing a youthful fault on the biggest stage in the world. The audience sat absolutely still, drawn into the agonizing intimacy of the moment. They were no longer viewers. They were silent witnesses to an intervention that had been delayed for half a lifetime. "Why, John?" Ruth asked, her voice cracking for the first time. "Why save it if you couldn't share it? Why let her pass on believing you had chosen the spotlight over her heart?" Johnny slowly placed one foot on the first step of the stage, almost as if he needed the physical support. "I kept it because it was the last honest thing I had written about my own feelings," he explained, the microphone catching the tremor in his tone. "I knew if I destroyed it, I'd be destroying the truth of what I felt for Clara. The success, the fame, the jokes, they started to feel hollow without her. The letter became my penance, my private anchor back to the man I should have been. Every time I reached a milestone, every time I accepted an award, I remembered that I traded my chance at real, simple happiness for this." He gestured broadly at the magnificent set around them, the gesture dripping with hollow irony. He looked directly at Ruth, making a raw, public confession of a pain he'd buried for decades. "I am so sorry, Ruth. I am so sorry I let your sister think I didn't choose her. I did, but I was a coward." The studio was now entirely upset, captivated by the depth of his regret. He had admitted the letter's existence and confessed his terrible mistake. But the audience still needed to know the one thing Ruth had carried across all those miles and years, exactly what was written on that piece of paper, the secret words of a young, desperately conflicted man named John Carson. Johnny Carson, the titan of late night, had lived his greatest years haunted by a single, undelivered letter, the only tangible proof of the man he chose not to be. In the profound silence of the studio, Johnny began to speak, his unamplified voice carrying the weight of 4 decades of regret. He confessed the letter's meaning, written on simple Omaha radio stationery, in stark contrast to the luxurious set around him. The note began as a plea. "Clara, if you read this, know that I've been offered the world, but the world feels like nothing without you to share it with." The heart of the letter was a challenge, an ultimatum against fame. "I am ready to give up the chase, give up the spotlight, and stay right here in Nebraska forever if you tell me that's what you want." He was willing to forfeit the legendary status that awaited him for her sake. The letter was saved because it represented a parallel, happier life, a road not taken. As Johnny recounted these words, his voice finally broke. The legendary composure, the Carson cool, fractured entirely, and tears began to stream down his face. These were the deep, racking sobs of a man releasing 40 years of pent-up emotional pain. The sheer cost of his celebrity was suddenly laid bare. His career was built on the silence of a declaration that was meant to save his heart. The audience and Ed McMahon openly wept with him, sharing the profound, cathartic realization that the king of late night was as human and heartbroken as any of them. The truth of the letter had finally done what 40 years of fame could not. It released him to grieve. With tears streaming down his face, the question hung in the air. Why did Johnny Carson sacrifice love for fear? It wasn't lust for fame, but a tragic human flaw. Johnny explained to Ruth that he had walked toward Clara's house ready to surrender his ambition. But as he approached, he saw a rival's expensive car, and Clara through the window, leaning on the other man's shoulder. It was an innocent moment of comfort, but the sight utterly shattered the 22-year-old John Carson. His deep-seated insecurity, the feeling that he wasn't enough, took root. He convinced himself she was moving on and needed a steady man, not a kid chasing Hollywood shadows. His ambition surged back, cloaked as self-protection. He crumpled the letter, pushed it deep into his pocket, and turned around, never knocking on the door. He drove away from Nebraska and Clara forever. "I was a fool," Johnny confessed, shaking his head slowly. "I chose the fear of rejection over the certainty of love, and I let her pass away believing I didn't care enough to choose her." He admitted that the foundation of his greatness was built on this terrible, private, emotional failure, a moment of self-doubt and misinterpretation. This was his final, painful reckoning, a potent reminder of the tragedy of unspoken truth. Don't let your truth remain unspoken. If Johnny Carson's tragic mistake resonated with you, drop a comment below and share a moment when you spoke up, or when you wish you had. We want to hear your stories of courage and conviction. After Johnny's heartbreaking confession, the tragic tale of misinterpretation and paralyzing fear that had defined his emotional life, the audience expected Ruth to deliver the final, crushing blow of resentment. She was the rightful bearer of 4 decades of pain. But Ruth had traveled across the country not to inflict pain, but to deliver a final, priceless gift, the gift of unconditional forgiveness. Johnny was still bent over, his shoulders shaking with the weight of his newly confessed shame. Ruth stepped down the one small step separating the audience from the stage, bridging the immense gulf between celebrity and humanity. She didn't touch him, but she spoke to him with the quiet authority of an old friend who had seen his heart when it was still young and clean. "John, stop," she said, her voice soft but firm. Clara knew. The words were so unexpected, so powerful, that Johnny instantly stilled. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes red and searching. "What did you say?" "Clara knew, John," Ruth repeated, stepping closer. "She knew you loved her more than the cameras. She knew that part of you never really left Norfolk. She felt your distance, yes, but she also knew your ambition was a part of your spirit, and she wouldn't have asked you to clip your own wings, even if she could have. She felt the love, John. She just didn't feel the finality of your choice." Ruth explained that in her sister's final, difficult months, Clara had clung to the funny, cheerful letters Johnny did send, the ones about the silly celebrities and the crazy scripts. She watched him on television every night, not as the king of late night, but as her John, the boy who made the whole country laugh. She didn't view his success as a betrayal, she viewed it as a continuation of the brilliance she had always seen in him. "You think I came here to ruin you?" Ruth asked, a ghost of a smile appearing on her face. "I came here to tell you that she forgave you long ago for being afraid. She didn't pass away angry, she passed away proud. My purpose tonight was not to punish the man you became, but to give peace to the young man who was too afraid to speak his truth." This was the emotional release the studio needed. The moment of truth wasn't about the content of the letter, it was about the profound understanding that even in silence, love can still be felt. Ruth, the messenger of accusation, had transformed into the angel of absolution. She had come to release Johnny from the cage of his own regret. Johnny finally stood up, his tall frame trembling. He walked toward Ruth, who was now standing fully exposed under the lights, and he did the only thing a man who had been given back his soul could do. He enveloped the frail, elderly woman in a powerful, gentle embrace. It was the hug 40 years overdue, a hug for Ruth, a hug for Clara, and a hug for the young John Carson, who finally got to say goodbye. The sight of the unflappable king of late night clinging to this ordinary woman, weeping in gratitude, completely overwhelmed the studio. This was no longer television, it was a deeply sacred moment of healing and final closure. The embrace lasted only a few seconds, but in that shared moment of weeping on the stage, Johnny Carson was reborn. He was no longer the conflicted celebrity, he was simply a man who had finally been granted peace. Stepping back from Ruth, who was herself wiping quiet tears, Johnny turned to face the millions of people watching him across America. He walked back to the desk, not to tell a joke, but to deliver the most profound, spontaneous address of his entire career. He picked up the microphone he had dropped, holding it gently, reverently, as if it were suddenly a sacred object. His eyes, though swollen and red, were clear. He looked directly into the primary camera, the one that saw him most intimately. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice still rough with emotion, "I am so sorry for interrupting the show tonight, but I thank God for this interruption." He paused, gathering his enormous, newfound vulnerability. "For 40 years, I carried a piece of paper in my life, a piece of paper that represented the cost of my ambition. I traded a life of simple, certain love for this incredible, glittering, but often hollow stage." This was the moment of his public reckoning, his spontaneous, raw apology not just to Ruth, but to every person watching who had ever regretted leaving words unsaid. He spoke about the terror of vulnerability, about how fame and success can build a wall around the heart, making it easier to be witty than to be honest. He spoke about Clara, calling her the great, defining what-if of his life. "Ruth came here tonight to set an old record straight," Johnny continued, his voice strengthening with conviction. "And in doing so, she reminded me that the most important words we speak are not the ones written on a cue card, but the ones written on our hearts." He thanked Ruth again, profoundly, and then, in a move that shocked the producers in the control booth, he asked the audience to do something entirely uncharacteristic. If there is someone in your life, a parent, a child, a friend, who needs to hear those 7 words you never delivered, don't wait 40 years. Don't wait one night. Say it now. The entire studio audience was now weeping openly. It wasn't pity for Johnny, it was the intense, shared emotional recognition that they too had letters they never sent. The atmosphere was cathartic, a mass moment of cleansing regret. Johnny turned and nodded to the executive producer, who was standing off camera, tears streaming down his own face. "We need a long commercial break, folks," he announced simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I need a moment to put my king face back on. But before we go," he smiled, a genuine, sad, beautiful smile, "I need to say thank you to this incredible woman, Ruth, for reminding me that being a good man matters far more than being a famous one." The moment the cameras cut to the break, Johnny walked off the stage, abandoning his cue cards and the remaining segments. The true story, the one that would define the rest of his life, was about to happen behind the scenes in the silence and privacy he had just so publicly discarded. Share this moment of vulnerability. If Johnny Carson's public apology for a lifetime of regret touched your heart, share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that the truth should never be left unspoken. The red tally light on the main camera blinked off, and the silence that rushed back into Studio One was filled not with shock, but with reverence. The emotional energy of the public confession was immense, but the true measure of the man was about to be seen in the moments the entire world was excluded from. This was the moment John Carson had to decide what the public apology was actually worth. He ignored the flurry of producers and stage managers who were rushing to triage the remainder of the show. He didn't stop to check his makeup or dry his eyes. He walked directly toward Ruth, who was waiting quietly by the aisle, still clutching her coat. He extended a hand and with profound dignity helped her walk off the riser and toward the privacy of his personal dressing room. Ed McMahon, watching from his desk, simply nodded, knowing that whatever came next was entirely private and absolutely vital. "I owe you more than I can ever repay, Ruth," Johnny said simply as they reached the sanctuary of his small, plush office. He poured them both a glass of water, his hands still trembling slightly. "You gave me back 40 years of peace I didn't deserve. You didn't come to take, you came to heal. And I want to do something for Clara, through you." Johnny insisted on canceling the remainder of his personal appearances for the next day. He instructed his personal secretary to immediately book Ruth on the first flight home to Nebraska the following morning, upgrading her to first class and covering every expense. But the gesture didn't stop there. He discovered that Ruth, a lifelong homemaker, was struggling financially following the long-term care of her sister and was facing mounting mortgage payments. Without asking, without a hint of fanfare, Johnny Carson called his lawyer into the dressing room. He dictated instructions for the immediate creation of a Clara Hayes Memorial Fund, funded entirely by his personal assets. The money was ostensibly for small community projects in Clara's hometown, but the first action of the fund was to discreetly purchase the mortgage on Ruth's small home, paying off the debt in full. He made it clear to Ruth, "This is not a reward and it's not charity. This is a promise kept. Fame brought me wealth, but Clara brought me the reason to use it. Please accept this so you can live out your remaining years with dignity, knowing your sister is honored." Ruth, overwhelmed by the simple, staggering generosity of the man who was now completely released of his secret, could only weep. She hugged him again, a far deeper hug than the one on stage. Johnny, meanwhile, felt a quiet, profound happiness wash over him, a feeling far warmer and more enduring than any applause. He hadn't just confessed his regret, he had actively rectified its consequences. When the commercial break finally ended and Johnny Carson reappeared on stage to seamlessly host the final 10 minutes of the show, he looked subtly different. The old charming mask was back, but his eyes held a softness and a depth they hadn't possessed before. The world saw the professional return to work, but Ruth and Ed McMahon knew that the man who had walked off stage was broken and the one who returned was whole. The true, private promise of that night was the foundation of a new life for one elderly woman and the quiet redemption of one legendary entertainer. The show concluded as usual that night, the applause fading to black, but nothing, absolutely nothing, was usual afterward. The man who walked off the stage was fundamentally different from the man who had frozen mid-monologue, and everyone who worked closely with him noticed the profound, quiet shift. That evening in 1984 became the emotional dividing line of Johnny Carson's life. Ed McMahon, who had watched his friend carry that emotional burden for years, later recalled that Johnny's laughter post-Ruth sounded richer, deeper, and somehow more genuine. After that night, Ed said, Johnny stopped trying to protect his heart on stage and started letting it breathe. His humor was still sharp, but it was warmer. He was less of an icon and more of a man. The entire show felt a subtle softening. The interviews gained more depth, the questions became more thoughtful, and his famous reticence about his personal life eased just enough to allow genuine compassion to shine through. Johnny never spoke publicly about the incident again, deflecting questions about the unscripted interruption with a practiced ease. But the private actions he took spoke louder than any public statement. He ensured the Clara Hayes Memorial Fund continued its work, discreetly funding scholarships in Norfolk, Nebraska, ensuring her name and memory were tied not to tragedy but to opportunity. Every annual report on the fund, which went only to Johnny and Ruth, was a quiet reminder of the day he was set released. The most powerful legacy of the entire event, however, lay in the meaning of the 7 words themselves. "You never gave her the letter, Johnny." was not just an accusation of failed love, it was a devastating indictment of a life lived in fear of vulnerability. Johnny Carson, the most powerful man in television, had allowed a moment of hesitation to cost him the deepest happiness he would ever know. Ruth, the quiet messenger, had forced him to face the devastating reality that ambition, left unchecked, can turn the heart to stone. The final, essential truth of that night is that we live in a world obsessed with public success, measuring value by fame, followers, and fortune. But on that Burbank stage, the man who had achieved all of it learned the most difficult lesson of his life. Success is hollow if it's achieved at the cost of your true self. The bravest thing Johnny Carson ever did wasn't facing 20 million people with a joke, but facing one old woman with the truth of his deepest, darkest regret. It wasn't the 7 words shouted that changed everything. It was the 40 years of silence those words finally released. He passed away a beloved legend, but that night he passed away a man at peace, thanks to the fierce love of one woman he lost and the profound courage of the woman who came to his rescue. If this story about the silence, regret, and ultimate redemption of Johnny Carson touched your heart, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories behind Hollywood's most emotional moments.